Okay, good morning everybody. It is Chol HaMoed Pesach, Erev Shavi Shel Pesach, and today's daf is Kaf Gimel, but we're going to start on the very bottom of Kaf Bet, Amud Bet, with the new Mishnah. It's four lines up from the bottom on Kaf Bet, Amud Bet. It says, Echad Bora Rabim, Uv'era Rabim, Uv'era Yachid, Osin Le'en Pasin. Aval lebora yachid osin lo mechitza gavoa 10 tefachim. So what is this talking about? So we've already spoken in the Masekhet several times, about the paseh beraot. Paseh beraot is this special leniency in terms of creating an enclosure that the rabbis permitted. On a biblical level, min haTorah, it is considered to be a valid mechitzot, valid walls. Rabbinically, it's generally prohibited to enclose an area using this method. And basically what it is a series of corner boards. In other words, you have two boards in each corner, two boards in the northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast corner. The boards are at right angles. So basically what you have is the corners demarcated of the area. Each board is at least an amma, which means that, let's say on the south side, to the left you have an amma board, to the right you have an amma board. If you're standing on the west, you'll see to the left of you an amma board, and to the right of you an amma board. If you're standing to the north, you'll see to the left an amma, and to the right an amma. So all you have in any case is basically an amma board to your right and an amma board to your left, separated by space. In each corner, the two are connected. Okay, so that's all you have. Now, these paseh beraot were permitted in order to allow people to access water, because the water was contained in either a well or a cistern that halachically is defined as a reshut hayachid, as a private domain because of its dimensions, and therefore to take water out of this pit, it doesn't seem like you're doing anything, right? But you're actually taking from a private domain into a public domain because you are standing in the public domain. You figure, well, I'll take the water out of the pit and I'll just stand here and drink it. So I'm not really carrying it anywhere, or the cow will drink it right here. But the fact is, just by extracting it from the private domain to the public domain, you've already done a malacha of transfer. So these paseh beraot create an enclosure where you can extract water from the well. So the question is, under what circumstances did they permit a person to make use of this special leniency? So the first opinion, Rabbi Akiva says, basically, you need one of two conditions, is the way we could summarize it. Either it has to be a be'er, which means flowing natural spring, or it has to be a bor harabim, it has to belong to the public. So he said, if you look at what he says it could be a bor harabim, a cistern of collected water. Why is that the fact that it's a cistern makes it less likely to be permitted, because it can run out of water. You can run out of water. So, and then people might go on carrying in the enclosure anyway, but since it's for the public, it's okay. Be'er means it's a spring of ma'im chayim, flowing waters. So Rabbi Akiva says, even if you have a private spring in your backyard, you happen to be lucky, you have a private spring in your backyard, you can make paseh beraot around that as well. It has to have either one of two conditions. Either it is a be'er, or it is something for the public. Okay, that's what Rabbi Akiva says. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, En osin pasin, ela lebe'er rabim bilvad, v'lashar osin chagora gavoa 10 tefachim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says the opposite, essentially. He says you can only use this dispensation of paseh beraot when you have two qualifications. Number one, it has to be a be'er, it has to be naturally flowing spring water of some sort that doesn't get exhausted, it doesn't get used up. So therefore, if we permit it, it's not going to run out of water during Shabbat. And secondly, it has to belong to the public. So what Rabbi Akiva said was, the only time you can't use it is when you have two negatives. It's a private cistern, right? Because you need two strikes against you, according to Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, you need two positive qualities to allow you. to use this dispensation, which is it has to be public, and it has to be a be'er, it has to be a continuous flow of water, exactly. Okay, so that's the machloket. But you can think of it in that way. If you think of these two qualities, Rabbi Akiva requires one or the other, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava requires both. Now we look at the Gemara beginning on Kaf Gimel Amud Aleph. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel. Rav Yosef said that Rav Yehuda said that Shemuel said halachak Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. The law follows Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. And again, what did Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava say? He said that you require two conditions. Okay, it has to be public and it has to be continuously flowing water. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel. And the same line of rabbis, Rav Yosef said that Rav Yehuda said that Shemuel said the hutru pasei beraot ela leber shel mayim chayim leber mayim chayim bilvad, that the leniency of the pasei beraot was only permitted for flowing natural spring kind of water. Now that sounds redundant, doesn't it? Because that's part of what Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava gave you two conditions. He said that it needed to be public, and he said that it needed to be flowing water, right? Not just collected water. So why did they have to say it twice? They said that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and then they also said that it has to be a flowing spring. It seems redundant. The answer is utsricha, we need both. Because the iyashmeinan halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava hava amina. De rabim va'afilu mikunasin. V'ay de katane be'era rabim la'apokem ed Rabbi Akiva. That really you might have misunderstood. You might have thought, if we had just told you the law follows Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, perhaps you would have misunderstood. And you would have thought that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava would permit any public collection of water, not just a flowing spring. But you might have thought that he was insisting against Rabbi Akiva that it had to be public. In other words, perhaps Rabbi Akiva requires one or the other quality. Either it's continuously flowing water, or it is something for the public. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, as long as it's something for the public, that's the bottom line. It must be something for the public. Okay, but it doesn't matter, whereas Rabbi Akiva would permit, let's say, a spring that was a private spring. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is saying it has to be public. It could be collected water, but it must be public. So that's why they had to tell you no. That Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava was requiring not just that it be public. He wasn't making that the be-all and end-all of the halacha. He was saying it needs both qualifications. It must be a public source of water, and it must be a naturally flowing source of water, not a collected source of water that could be depleted. Okay, that's what the Gemara is saying. Now, so maybe you'll tell me, okay, if that's the case, then why didn't Rav Yosef say that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said that it has to be flowing water? Why did they mention the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? Because hava amina lo shenad rabim v'lo shenad yachid. Because again, you might have thought that maybe that's the only thing that matters. Maybe the only thing that matters is whether it's flowing water. We don't care about whether it's public or private. Therefore, that's why they had to tell you the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. In other words, they needed both of these statements so that you got both points. Because it's possible to misunderstand Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava as just giving an example of, the only time it's permitted is when you have flowing water that is public. Maybe he was just disputing Rabbi Akiva on one of the points, either on the spring water point or on the public point. Now we know that both are being, in other words, that he's requiring both of those, and so they had to reiterate that not just as Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava telling you it has to be public, he's also telling you it needs to be continuously flowing water. The new Mishnah says, "V'od amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava." There was another stringency that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said, "Hagina v'karpaf shehen 70 ama v'shirayim al 70 ama v'shirayim hamukafot gader gavoa 10 tefachim metaltalin betocha." Now, this is an interesting halacha that the rabbis created. According to Deoraita, in other words, Mideoraita from the Torah, the law is that any enclosure is a Reshut HaYachid. We don't care if 500 people use it. We don't care if 5 million people use it. We don't care if it's a garden. We don't care if it's a park. We don't care what it is. If it's enclosed, halachically, that's all that we need to know. However, the rabbis did sort of limit this dispensation and say that if something is mukaf, if something is enclosed, not shelo ladira, it's not enclosed for the purposes of dwelling, but it's enclosed, let's say, as a garden, or a karpaf is some kind of a field or an open area, so it's not intended to be it's not intended to be lived in. So then there are limits on how large such an area can be, so that even if it's enclosed on Shabbat, you can't carry in there. Even if it's enclosed, because only enclosures for human residents are recognized as valid enclosures, up to a certain point. So that's why they have problems with Eruvin. If they want to include an Eruv, let's say, places that have large parks, because a large park, even if with the enclosure of the Eruv, isn't counted as being enclosed. So let's say they wanted to make one of the, I'm talking about the Ashkenazi Eruvin that have the wire around the city. So if they have a wire around the city, so let's say that I don't know, what's it called? Yellowstone Park is like right in the middle of it, So it doesn't matter how good the Eruv is. The fact is, even a wall wouldn't be good for such a large area that's enclosed, not for the purposes of human dwelling. Okay, so that's a big problem actually, even in modern day Eruv construction. So, ubilvad sheba shomira o betira o shetis muchala'ir. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says that I have two qualifications. Again, he likes the two qualifications. He's on the two qualification direction today. He says, first of all, it has to be under 70 and v'shirayim, he says here, which it's going to turn out to be 70 and 2/3 amah. By 70 and 2/3 amah, if it's an area of that dimension, it could be permitted to carry there only if you have at least some little house in there. A shomerah is a place that the shomer sits, that the person who's guarding the area sits. Okay, or it's attached to a city, meaning it's right off of the city, so it's part of that. Or it has a beit dira, or it has a house on the premises. So you need two things. You can have a field enclosed, but there has to be at least some presence of human dwelling there. And then, as long as it's under a certain maximum size, it's okay. So you need under a certain maximum size, and you also need that there be some human dwelling there, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Afilu en ba elabor v'shiach ume'ara metaltalin betocha." According to Rabbi Yehuda, you know what? You don't need a beit dira. You don't need any human dwelling presence in that field. All you need is either a cistern or some kind of a pit or some kind of a cave, anything that could conceivably be used for some human activities. Okay, it's not just a field where plants are growing, but it's something that where we might draw water, or if we wanted to camp out, we could go live in the cave. Something like that. There has to be something that has some potential for human activity in there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual house or an actual structure. Rabbi Akiva says, you don't need anything, actually, Rabbi Akiva says. As long as it doesn't go over the maximum of 70 and 2/3 amah by 70 and 2/3 amah, you don't need a house, you don't need a cistern, you don't need a pit, you don't need a cave. He says that that's no problem up to that minimum size, or that maximum size, rather. Rabbi Eliezer says, Im hayta orka yater al ruchba, afilu amma achat in metaltalin betocha. Rabbi Eliezer comes along with another qualification. He says, this whole thing about the karpaf, about the enclosed field, if the length is greater than the width, that's also not good, because you said, as Rabbi Akiva says, it has to be 70 and 2/3 amah by 70 and 2/3 amah, which is a square. Okay? If it is rectangular, such that one side is longer than the other, so then it's not going to be allowed, because the rabbis only allowed you to enclose these non-dwelling places under very specific conditions. Now you can understand why, because they wanted people to differentiate. All of the rabbinic restrictions on carrying come down to people making a mistake or misunderstanding the difference between a public and a private domain. And so areas that were enclosed, like a chatzer, like a courtyard, even though they're really technically on a biblical level, they are private domains because they're enclosed, they are viewed socially as public domains because everybody uses them. A karpaf, a field or a gina, a garden, even if it's enclosed, nobody's going to look at it and say it's a private domain, because it's not people think of a private domain as a place where you live. Okay, so there's a lot of and if people knew that you could, for example, carry in the karpaf, they might say, well, if I can carry in this huge field, a huge field, just because it has a fence around it, why can't I carry in the shuk? What's the difference? It's not a, they're not going to see. Rabbi Yosei says, even if the length is twice the width, you can still carry in it. In other words, what he means to say is, this thing that Rabbi Eliezer said that it had to be square, I disagree. You can even have the length twice as long as the width, a relatively narrow rectangle, and that would still be okay. Amar Rabbi Eli says, Shamati mi Rabbi Elazar, and it says here on the side that it should say Rabbi Eliezer, that even if it's the size of a beit kur, that is like much larger. I think that if you calculate the area, it's 15 times as big as because the 70 and 2/3 amah by 70 and 2/3 amah is approximately, although not exactly 5,000. Right, it's a little bit less. It's almost 5,000, and I think the beit kur is like 75,000 or something like that. So it's much larger. It's much larger. So we heard from Rabbi Eliezer that it doesn't matter. Even a beit kur, and I also heard from him some other unrelated halachot. Anshe chatzir shechach echad mehan v'lo erev beito asor melachnis v'lo tzilo aval lehem mutar. That as we're going to see later in the Gemara, this is there's a lot of later in the Masekhet, a lot of discussion about the eruvei chatzerot, that we're always referring to them, and you refer to them throughout Shas. Oh, eruvei chatzerot, but you don't really know what they are until you come to Masekhet Eruvin and you get into the details. But we've talked about it many times, that if you have a courtyard with multiple residences in the courtyard, and what happens with the multiple residences is that they have to combine together by taking a meal and saying we're all one family here, so we can use the chatzer as a shared area, so it goes from being a public area to a shared private area. So what happens if one of the guys failed to participate in the eruv? He can actually mess it up for everybody if he refuses to participate. This is another problem with modern day creation of eruvin, because how do I know that every Jew in this town wants to be part of my eruv? They just decided, maybe you could see that you could opt out. Right, so what happens if one guy didn't participate? There are many problems with it, but we're not here to get into that. So that could be a series of shiurim another time. But one of the problems is you need participation. So if the people, if somebody forgot, he didn't participate in the eruv. So now the problem is that now you have two domains, because you have that guy's domain and you have everybody else's domain. Now everybody else combined together into one. But he didn't, so you still have two. It's still a problem. You have to have everybody as one. So there's a way that we're going to see later in the Gemara how exactly they worked it out, that he can't carry in and out of his house. Okay, so he basically withdraws. It's called bitul reshut. It's another way of solving the problem other than eruv. Eruv is when everybody comes together. Bitul is when one guy says, you know what? You can have the chatzer, I don't care. I don't want it. I'm not going to take out of my house to the chatzer. I'm not going to take from the chatzer into my house. You guys do what you want. So as long as he doesn't take anything in and out, he's basically mivatel. He's giving them his portion. So that's another way that it can work. So that's why it says he can't bring in and out, but they can bring in and out. Okay, we're going to see details about this later. V'chen shamati mimenu shiyotzin ba'ar kablin ba'pesach. I also heard that you can use this certain type of a vine that apparently grows around trees that's very bitter as maror on Pesach. Look at that. That's we're talking about Inyana Dioma. V'chazarti al kol talmidav, and I went to all of his students. Uvikashti li chaver, and I tried to find a friend. He didn't mean that he was trying to find a friend personally. He meant that he was trying to find somebody else who had heard these three halachot. I couldn't find anybody else to corroborate what I heard. He said, listen, I know what I heard with my own ears, but nobody else heard this. And when you hear something and nobody else hears it, you start to wonder if maybe you made a mistake. But he said there are these three halachot that I'm pretty sure that I heard directly from Rabbi Eliezer, and I couldn't corroborate it with any of his other students that they heard the same thing I heard. And since some of these halachot are somewhat unusual, particularly about the maror, adding something to the list of maror that wouldn't be normally added, or allowing a very, very large karpaf to be enclosed. So I would need to have somebody else to corroborate my story. I can't go out on my own here. So the Gemara starts out by asking an interesting stylistic question about the Mishnah. It says, "My Tana the katane ve'od. Why does the Mishnah start by saying ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? And further did Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava say, etc. Now when you read Mishnayot and you learn Mishnayot, these kinds of problems don't bother you as much because you actually read it as a flowing text. When you read the Mishnah, and they read it as a flowing text too. So a lot of times you'll read it, if you read a whole parak of Mishnah, you're reading it, this says, Ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. This, you're like, oh, well, it's all part of the same thing. But they're pointing out that it's inconsistent. When it says Ve'od is inconsistent. Not because it starts out with what seems like you're in the middle of the conversation. That wouldn't be a problem, because you actually, when you're reading Mishnayot, you are in the middle of a conversation, because if you look at the Mishnah by itself, the whole parak is one thing. One entity. But the problem is, why does it sometimes say ve'od and sometimes doesn't? So, Ilema, maybe you're going to tell me that Mishum detana lechada lechumra vekatane achariti Mishum achi katane ve'od. Maybe you're going to tell me because Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and this is how I explained it when we were reading the Mishnah. I explained it that it meant that he taught one stringency and now he's teaching another stringency, because in the previous Mishnah he told us the stringency that in order to use the pasei bera'ot you have to have two conditions. It has to be public and it has to be a be'er. It has to be a flowing a flowing spring. It can't be a cistern or a well. Okay? And so now he's coming along and telling you a stringency that in order to enclose a place that's not for human dwelling, you need a maximum size, as well as you need some kind of a structure there for a person to actually live. Or it has to be right next to the city. Right? Maybe that's the reason. But wait a second. If you go back earlier in our Masekhet, you will find that Rabbi Yehuda did the same thing. Rabbi Yehuda earlier in the Masekhet on Daf Yudchet had said, or really it's on Yud Zayin Amud Bet, that Rabbi Yehuda had where is it? No, it's on Yudchet, sorry. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad Bet Satayim, that they were talking about how large the area could be that you enclose with these pasei bera'ot around the well. In other words, how large can the well be? How large can the space be here that you're enclosing with these makeshift machitzot? And so he was putting a limit, and the rabbi said, no, limits are only for other things, but for this could be as big as you want, and it doesn't matter as long as you don't have too much space between the boards, and you add boards if necessary, it's no problem to enclose even a larger area. So Rabbi Yehuda had one stringency, and then later on, Rabbi Yehuda had an additional stringency, which was... Where's the other one? Oh, I remember. Yeah, that it was the that he talked about in the previous discussion about the it's on Kaf Bet, on the previous discussion where they talked about making the pasei bera'ot in a public area where the public will pass through as a thoroughfare. Right? So that's another stringency where Rabbi Yehuda said, Yisal let's stadim, you have to move it to the side. You can't have the pasei bera'ot in a public area where people are walking right through it, because if they're walking right through it, we say that the people come, atu rabbim u'mevatlei mechitzta, that they're going to break the wall. It's not really a wall if people are passing through it, right? So he had two stringencies. Rabbi Yehuda had one stringency about the size of the area that can be enclosed by the pasei bera'ot, and then he had another stringency about about putting it in a public area where people are going to pass through. So why doesn't it say ve'od, the second stringency? Why does it say ve'od? The answer is because over there, hatam afsekor rabbanan, chalo afsekor rabbanan. That over there, the rabbis interrupt him, because Rabbi Yehuda says his piece, and then what happens is that the rabbis say, no, that measurement of 70, that measurement of two sa'ah, of satayim, right? It was only said about a karpaf, about a field, about a garden, but the bet satayim measurement wasn't said about the size of a well that can be enclosed. So they got the last word. So in the next Mishnah, when Rabbi Yehuda comes around, it can't say ve'od, because it wasn't talking about Rabbi Yehuda. Whereas here, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava got the last word in the previous Mishnah. So it makes sense in our Mishnah for it to say ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and further did he say, because it was still in the middle of talking about what he said. Does that make sense? However, wait a second. Is it really true that whenever the rabbis interrupt somebody that they don't continue by saying ve'od? But there's a case in Masekhet Sukkah in which Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim have an argument. The argument is that there are two arguments. Rabbi Eliezer says that on Sukkot you have to have 14 seudot, one in the morning and one in the night, every day of Sukkot. Or I should say the other way, one in the evening and one in the morning, every day of Sukkot. Every day. 14 seudot, minimum. And he also says that if a person didn't eat a kazayit on the first night of Sukkot, he can make up for it on the last night of Sukkot. In other words, on the night of Shemini Atzeret, he can have another meal. So if he missed the first meal, he can have a meal on Shemini Atzeret and it will count. And the rabbis dispute him on both of these points. First of all, we know the halacha that you only have to eat a kazayit of bread the first night of Sukkot. You don't have to eat the rest of the time. If you decide not to eat bread the rest of Sukkot, that's fine. We know that. Number one. Number two, the Chachamim say, how can you make up for something on Sukkot with something on Shemini Atzeret, which is a different holiday, and you don't even eat in the Sukkah in Israel on Shemini Atzeret? So how could that be? So they argue with him, and there it doesn't say, and there it says, Ve'od amar Rabbi Eliezer. So it says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yud Daled Seudot Chayav Adam Le'echol B'Sukkah. This is, I'm reading from the Rashi here, that you have to eat 14 Seudot. Chachamim Omrim Eila Davar Kitzvah. And the rabbis say there's no measurement like that. You eat on the first night. You don't have to meet a 14 Seudot for the whole holiday. And Ve'od Amar Rabbi Eliezer Mishal Achal Leil Yom Tov Harishon Yesh Leil Yom Tov Acharon. So you see that it said Ve'od Amar Rabbi Eliezer, even though he was interrupted by the rabbis. He didn't get the last word and then continue. He said his piece. The rabbis interrupted with their position, and then he said ve'od. So why does the Mishnah say ve'od there? If any time the rabbis interrupt, we don't say ve'od. So what's the answer? Hatam b'miltehu dafsekua. Hacha b'milta achariti dafsekua. The difference is that over there, what did the rabbis actually say? Rabbi Eliezer says 14 seudot are required in the sukkah. The rabbis say no, 14 seudot are not required. Okay, and they says, and further he said that if you didn't eat on the first night, you can eat on the last night. So they were just responding to him. He was still controlling the conversation, so to speak. Okay, he was still controlling the conversation. So it made sense for it to say ve'od. Over here with Rabbi Yehuda, though, in our Masechet, Rabbi Yehuda said that you can only enclose a well up to bet satayim, only up to this maximum size. And then the rabbis say, no, it was only said a bet satayim about this case and this case and this case. But in the case of a well, that doesn't apply. So they took over the conversation and started talking about where does bet satayim, that measurement, apply. So since they changed the subject, basically, the rabbis took ownership of the conversation, they took control of the conversation, they changed the subject, therefore, he can't say ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda because he was out, the ball was no longer in his, under his control, right? It passed over to the other team. Whereas in the case of Rabbi Eliezer, he was still talking. They interrupted him, so to speak, by saying, no, you're wrong about 14 meals in Sukkot. He said, well, also this. But he was still the one talking.
Is the confusion with ve'od that's being introduced here, is that because they're not sure where it comes from? Like who actually made that statement?
No, they're just trying to make, right now what they're trying to do is figure out stylistically, when does the Mishnah use ve'od?
No, but why?
And when not?
Why does that?
Just because it seems inconsistent.
Oh, just that. Okay.
I think that's why.
Introduce a confusion with regards to.
No, we know who said everything.
Right.
I think it's just the Gemara presumes that every word that's used in the Mishnah, follows rhyme or reason. So if it's saying ve'od, if you're telling me,
like in other words, they're just questioning.
They just want to know why does it sometimes they'll have two stringencies mentioned by the same rabbi right after the other, one after the other, and it doesn't say ve'od. Why not? Sometimes it does say ve'od. What is it? What's the logic behind it? So the answer is stylistically, it's explained basically in a pshat level that there's no deeper meaning beyond the fact that when the rabbis commandeer the conversation and turn it in a different direction. So there you could see why it's no longer Rabbi Yehuda talking anymore. It's now the Chachamim said more than Rabbi Yehuda did.
It could have been because of some kind of a confusion with the text itself.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. Maybe. So basically that's the way that they answer it is whenever the original speaker is still the one directing the conversation, it says ve'od. Whenever he had the last word or whatever interruption there was minimal. But whenever the Chachamim take over the conversation, so now you can't say ve'od anymore because the ve'od, the last person who was really talking was the Chachamim, not the rabbi that in question. Now, Rabbi Akiva Omer afilu And Rabbi Akiva said, as long as we have this karpaf, we have this field that's enclosed, and again, it's not a dwelling area, even if it doesn't have any means or any kind of structure related to human activity or human dwelling, it could still be enclosed up to this maximum measurement of 70 2/3 amah by 70 2/3 amah, according to Rabbi Akiva. Now we turn to Amud Bet. Rabbi Akiva Hainu Tanakama. Rabbi Akiva is clearly saying the same as what the Tanakama said. In other words, the original Mishnah stated that you have up to 70 2/3 amah by 70 2/3 amah. Now we're not talking about this Mishnah. We're talking about the original Tanakama that was arguing with Rabbi Yehuda that we mentioned before. Okay, the original Chachamim who said that you need, that for a karpaf to be enclosed, you need 70 2/3 amah by 70 2/3 amah. That doesn't apply to the case of a well, but it does apply to a karpaf. We already saw that. The Chachamim said that. So why is it attributed to Rabbi Akiva here? Rabbi Akiva is not the originator of this view. This is the accepted view. So the answer is, Ika beinayu, there's a difference between them. Davar mu'at, a small amount. Why? Detanya, because it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Davar mu'at yesh al shiv'im ama v'shirayim v'lo natanu chachamim bo shi'ur. V'chama shi'ur, satayim kechatzer mishkan. That the machloket is, that according to Rabbi Akiva, there is a more precise mathematical calculation of 70 2/3 amah by 70 2/3 amah. But bet satayim is actually slightly more than that. It's exactly 5,000 square amot, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva's view, which is 70 by 2/3 times 70 by 2/3, will come out to slightly less than 5,000 square amot. Okay? So it's mathematically speaking, it's a fraction. It's fractional, but it's slightly less than the 5,000. And he's saying that according to the Chachamim, you get the full 5,000. According to Rabbi Akiva, he's slightly stricter. He says that you have to go by the length 70 2/3 amah, 70 2/3 amah. 70 2/3 amah, by the way, is going to be 70 amot and 4 tefachim, because an amah is 6 tefachim. So it's 70 amot and 4 tefachim by 70 amot and 4 tefachim, and there's going to be some fraction of a tefach in there, difference between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. And where does he get this from? Where does he get this idea of the size of the Mishkan teaching us bit shi'ur satayim, the measurement where 2 sa'ah of grain can be planted? Where does he get this from? Because the Amar Karpaka says in the Amar Rav Yehuda says the Amar Karpaka pasuk says Orech HaChatzer me'ah ba'amah, that the length of the Chatzer was 100. This is talking about the Chatzer, the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, or the Mishkan rather. The courtyard of the Mishkan was 100 amot in length. V'rochav 50 b'chamishim, and it says its width was 50 by 50. So what does it mean 50 by 50? That doesn't make any sense. 50 by 50 tells you length and width. What does it mean that the width was 50 by 50? It should say the length was 100 and the width was 50. Right? It should say me'ah b'chamishim. It was 100 by 50. Not 150 by 50. That doesn't make any sense. Rather, what is the Amrat Torah? The Torah is telling you, tol chamishim v'sabeb chamishim. What you do is, you take the extra 50 and you make it into a square. So what Rashi explains this in an extremely elaborate way to visualize it. I think that probably one of these books with illustrations probably shows Rashi's analysis, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to go through that to figure it out. It's very simple. We don't have to do the math to understand the point. Okay. If you have something that is 100 amot long and is 50 amot wide, you could easily cut it in half into 2 squares of 50 by 50. Correct? I don't have to be an engineer to know that. Isn't that correct, Matthias, the home developer? Okay. So you have 50 by 50. So now what he's saying is basically, if instead of having a rectangle of 100 by 50, you were to take the amot that you have in that extra 50 by 50 square and combine them and just make a larger square. In other words, the same amount of quantitatively, but instead of it being shaped like a rectangle, you reshaped it into a square, essentially. That's what it's saying. Okay, now Rashi explains, you take a strip this size, you take a piece this size and you put it here. You take strips and you put them on the outside of the square, and then you fill in the corners, and then you take another strip and you put it here around this. It's like he has a way of visualizing it geometrically, but visualizing it in a concrete way, like as if you were to take, they have it there. They have a diagram in the art scroll of how he talks about taking pieces of the extra half of the chatzer and actually placing them in different positions around the perimeter of the other square. But the point is, when you do that, what are you going to come out with at the end of the day? You're going to come out with this bet satayim. You're going to come out with a square that's a bet satayim that is this 5,000 square amma area. That's what you're going to have. And Rabbi Akiva's definition is slightly smaller than that. So this is going to be slightly larger than Rabbi Akiva's definition of size.
I don't know what's the square root of 5,000.
What is the square root?
No.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. It's 70-some fraction. Right, it's 70-some fraction.
That's the reason you have to.
Right, so because it's a precise fraction, so Rabbi Akiva goes with a tefach. It's easier. It's somewhere in between tefachim, so he doesn't want to deal with that. So the chachamim are, from a square root perspective, it would be more precise. But Rabbi Akiva, since he's dealing with length and width, and he wants it to be in whole tefachim, he doesn't want to get into fractional tefachim, so he doesn't want to get into the actual square roots. So anyway, but pashtei dikra b'ma'iketiv. Now, but basically, this is where the rabbis got the idea that you would have an area of 5,000 square amot is an area of significance, of halachic significance. Now, obviously, this is rabbinic halachic significance because the rabbis made this idea that an enclosed area that's not for human dwelling has a maximum size that it's allowed to be. According to the Torah, you could have the entire world with a fence around it, and that would be good. It doesn't matter. Enclosure is enclosure. Some of the poskim talk about, why is the United States of America? I mean, the Rishonim they don't talk about the United States of America, but they talk about why can't something like the United States of America? We have oceans on different. You're bordered by North America. Has mountains and oceans and all that. So if you use all the natural enclosures, you could say the whole place is there Reshut HaYachid. So there's a discussion. There's a whole discussion about that now. But anyway. Really though, definitely if you had a fence going around the United States, so min ha-Torah, you would say, there shouldn't be a problem, right? Now, the Great Wall of China or something like that, it should be a problem. Now, there are some Rishonim that hold that there's even min ha-Torah, there is a limit. It has to be able to be seen, whatever. Yeah. Otherwise, it just becomes silly because you could say anything is enclosed somehow, somewhere, and we'll just say everything's a Reshut HaYachid. We're not going to say that. So, but in any case, so the idea here is that we know that the Torah cannot be teaching us a rabbinic halacha. So what was the pshat? What was the literal meaning when it said chamishim b'chamishim? Because it says something that doesn't make sense. It says it's 100 long, and the width is 50 by 50. Width can't be 50 by 50. It has to be one number. So what is chamishim b'chamishim? So he says, Amar Abaye says, Hamed mishkan al sifat chamishim. Kedei she'er chamishim amal lefanav, ve'esrim amal lechol ruach baruach. Now, the way you have to envision it is like this, that the courtyard is, now remember the courtyard in the mishkan, the chatzer of the mishkan doesn't have a roof. It's open. Okay, it's 100 amot long. And what is called mishkan in the Torah is the enclosed part, which is the smaller part. The tabernacle is the smaller part that has the kodesh and the kodesh HaKodeshim inside and has all those curtains draped over it and has a roof over it of 3 layers, right? That's the mishkan. So what it's saying is that if you divide the court, where exactly should the mishkan be situated? We don't exactly know. So what it says is, cut the courtyard in half. Chamishim b'chamishim means, cut the courtyard in half and place the mishkan right at the edge of 50. So one half of the courtyard, in other words, if you were the first half of the courtyard of the 50 is just empty space. Then you come to the mishkan at the 50 line. And since the mishkan is situated in the center and it is 30 amot wide, so what you end up having is 20 to your left and 20 to your right, so it's symmetrical. Right? It's symmetrical. So you have anyway, you have a lot of symmetry because you have that the Mishkan is situated exactly at the 50 line. It's right in the middle. You have 20 to the right and 20 to the left. And so that's what it's trying to teach you. Okay? It's trying to teach you where to put the Mishkan. What?
10.
Oh, I'm sorry, 10 and 10. Right, not 20 and 20. Right, 10 and 10. Right. So the... That would add on another 20 amot, right? So 10 to the right and 10 to the left. So it's centered. So it's teaching you where it should be. It should be centered relative to the length of the chatzer, and it should be centered relative to the walls of the chatzer, relative to the width of the chatzer. That's what the pasuk is actually trying to teach you. Okay, okay. So now Rabbi Eliezer says, Imaita or ka. So now he talks about the length relative to the width, right? 1 second. I just wanted to see something here. See, I made a mistake. I made a mistake, and I made a mistake on top of the mistake. Okay. What it is that the Mishkan is 30 amot in length, not in width. So it's actually 20 on either side. It is 20 on either side. That's what I thought. So it's 20 on either side because the width of it is only 10.
Well, it's
okay.
19.
The length is right because the wall. You have to count the inner wall of the Mishkan. Right? So if you count the inner wall, so then it ends up being 20 on either side. It is 20 on either side, and it's 30 in length, so it's 20 from the back of the from the chatzer as well. That's why it is, because since it extends back 30 into the 50, so there's 20 between it and the back wall of the chatzer. There's 20 to the right and 20 to the left, because it's only 10 in width. It's 30 in length. That's what it was. Okay, that's why 20 and 20 didn't make sense. All right, now, so Rabbi Eliezer says if the length is greater, he had said that if the length is greater at all than the width, it's no good, meaning it has to be square. But we learned in the Rabbi Eliezer Omerim Haita Orka Yeter Al Pishanayim Berochba Afilu Ama Achat in Metadlim Betocha. That he said that if it's more than double, then it's no good. In other words, if the length is more than double the width, it's no good. But it doesn't have to be exactly this. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. It doesn't have to be square. Our Mishnah makes it sound like Rabbi Eliezer says that in order for an enclosure that's not for human beings, a karpaf, that's not for human residents, to count as an enclosure, it has to be square. No, Rabbi Eliezer didn't say that. He said that it can't be that the length is double the width. But but then you're going to have Amar Rav Bevai Bar Abaye said, what our Mishnah also meant was that if it's more than double. So when Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah says if the length is more than the width, it's no good, he meant if it's more than double the width, it's no good. But if that's the case, I know the Rabbi Yosei. But if that's the case, isn't that the same opinion as Rabbi Yosei? Rabbi Yosei says in our Mishnah that we read before that Rabbi Yosei said afilu orka pi shenayim berochba metadlim betocha, that even if the length is double the width, you can still carry. Meaning, if it's more than that, it's no good. Right? He said that it can only be up to double the width. So that's the same as what according to this, that's the same as what Rabbi Eliezer holds. You're making them the same. So the answer is, how are we going to respond to this? So, Ika benayu ribu'a de ribu'a rabbanan. That the difference between them is the square that the rabbis made. So Rashi explains. Rabbi Eliezer savar orka yoter mishnayim berochba in metaltelin umiu. But he says, Ikara orka pishanayim berochba kidichtiv velet le ribu'a. That according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's not even a preference that it be square. You can have it as double, the length can be double the width and it's no problem, just don't make it more than that. But he doesn't have an issue with it, he doesn't prefer it to be square. According to Rabbi Yossi, it should really be square. But we can be lenient as long as the length is not the size of is not double, more than double the width. But according to Rabbi according to Rabbi Yossi, if I were to come to Rabbi Yossi and say, "Excuse me, Rabbi Yossi, I would like to make a karpaf. I would like to make an enclosed area that I want to make a garden, a large garden for strolling and on Shabbat, and I want to know how large can it be that I can still stroll in it and carry things in there on Shabbat. That it's going to be enclosed, but it's not going to be enclosed for human residents." And he's going to tell you, "Well, make it square. You should make it square." Whereas according to Rabbi Eliezer, you don't have to make it square. Make it whatever shape you want. Just don't let the length be double the width. That's all. But you can make it whatever size you want. Okay, that's the difference. Whatever shape you want. That's the difference between them. Rabbi Yosef was stated, Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel halachak Rabbi Yosef. According to Rav Yehuda, again, Rav Yosef said that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said that the halacha follows Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef is the one that said that it can be length can be up to double the width. but not more for Rav Bevai. But Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and Rav Bevai said that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said halacha Rabbi Akiva. No, the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva that it has to be an exactly square 70 2/3 amah by 70 2/3 amah. It can't be that it's almost, the length is almost twice the width. Or exactly twice the width. V'tarvayu lekula. And actually, in both of these cases, it sounds like a contradiction, right? Because it sounds like, how can you say the halacha is, it's like the joke with the rabbi with the two litigants. The one says, the first litigant speaks and he says, you're right. The second litigant speaks and says, you're right too. And then his wife says, how can they both be right? He says, you're right. So first he says, Rabbi Yossi, you're right. It could be rectangular, and it could be the length could be 2 times the width. And then he says to Rabbi Akiva, you're also right. It has to be 70 2/3 amah. How could it be? How could the halacha follow both? They're contradictory. So utricha, because it's taking the leniencies of both. Diashmein halacha Rabbi Yossi, because if I had Rabbi Yossi, hava amina adika shomira o bet dira. Because remember, according to one opinion, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bavan, the beginning of the Mishnah, we said that you needed to have some kind of a residential structure in this karpaf to allow it to be used. So first of all, what we're saying is that in terms of shape, we're going with Rabbi Yosei. We're saying it can be any shape you want. It could be rectangular as long as the length is not more than twice the width. And we don't require any additions to the karpaf. It does not have to have any kind of structure, a shomira or whatever it is, or a house. So kamashmalan halachak Rabbi Akiva. That's why we mentioned the halachah is like Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva was the one that disputed in the beginning of the Mishnah and said that no, you don't need anything. You don't even need a cistern. You don't even need a cave. You don't need anything resembling a human dwelling here. And if I were to go with Rabbi Akiva, then I would say Hava Amina. Then I would have thought that's why I need you to tell me that the halacha is like Rabbi Yosei, because if I had heard only what Rabbi Akiva said, if you had told me the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, I'm going to think, okay, good. I don't need there to be any structure. I don't need there to be a watchman's tower. I don't need there to be any kind of cave or anything. But what I do need is that it be square. Because that's what Rabbi Akiva said. It had to be 70 2/3 amah by 70 2/3 amah. So I need to know that I can take both leniencies. I can take the leniency of Rabbi Akiva that I don't need any human dwelling on the premises. And I can take the leniency of Rabbi Yossi that it can be any shape that I want. As long as it doesn't exceed the maximum, it could be that the length is twice the width, and that's no problem.
Rabbi Akiva doesn't say only that it has to be square, and it has to be exactly 70 and 2/3 by 70.
And he also said that it didn't require any dwelling on the premises. So we're taking just that leniency from him. We're not taking his stringency. So now we have karpaf shu yoter mi bet satayim. If you have a karpaf that is more than bet satayim, so it exceeds this minimum amount. Okay, shehu kaf ladira. But the thing is that actually there is some kind of a dira there. There is some kind of a residence there. In other words, let's say you have a gigantic garden. It's more than the maximum amount that you're normally allowed to enclose, not for human purposes. But the only thing is, your house is on the premises. You have your house, and then you have a huge open field, and it says, "And nizra rubo harihu kagina v'asor." If the majority of this large area that's enclosed, the enclosed area is more than the maximum that you're allowed to enclose for a non-dwelling purpose. Okay, so if the majority of it is planted, then it is like a gina. It's going to be like a garden, ve'asur, and since it exceeds the maximum amount, it doesn't matter that you have your dwelling on the premises. It exceeds the maximum amount, and it's primarily not for dwelling. It's mainly not for dwelling, so it's not going to help you. Natarubo harihu kachatzer mutar. However, if he planted trees in the majority, it's like a courtyard, because tree groves are places that people go to walk. Right? People have in their yard tree groves and things like that. So it's still considered like human dwelling. Nizra rubo. So you said that if it was the majority was planted, now it becomes like a gina, it becomes like a garden. So Amar Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua said, Lo amaran ele yoter mi bet satayim, aval bet satayim mutar. That's true only. In other words, we have to envision, let's say that the entire space of this karpaf was 3 se'ah instead of satayim. Okay? And inside, so you have your house in 1 se'ah's space. And then you have more than or less than that, and then you have 2.5 satayim left, 2.5 sa'ah space left, and it's all garden. So the majority is garden, right? and the garden is more than a betzatayim itself. In other words, if you wanted to enclose that garden separately, you wouldn't be able to. Because in and of itself, it exceeds the measurement of betzatayim. In and of itself. So if that's the case, then definitely that would be a problem. Okay, you definitely wouldn't be able to enclose your house together with such a large field. However, if it's exactly betzatayim, if it's exactly the maximum, that if you wanted to enclose just that seated part by itself, you would be allowed to, then it's no problem. Then it's no problem. And who is that going? Like Kiman Rabbi Shimon. This is following Rabbi Shimon's position. Titan Rabbi Shimon Omer, Echad gagot, v'achad chatzerot, v'achad karpifot, reshut achat hen lakelim sheshavatu betochan, ve'lo lakelim sheshavatu betoch habayit. Okay, so what he says is that according to Rabbi Shimon, any outside enclosed area, roof, a courtyard, a karpaf, they're all considered one reshut. They're all considered one domain. You can carry from one to the other. You can't carry from your house into the courtyard without an eruv. Okay, you can't carry from the courtyard into your house without an eruv. But from the courtyard to the karpaf, that are both enclosed, you can carry something that was left in the karpaf before Shabbat into the chatzer and vice versa. So since your chatzer basically is open to this karpaf, it's open to this garden area, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's no problem to carry from something that's in this courtyard into this garden. So as long as the garden itself qualifies that you could have enclosed it by itself, because it doesn't exceed the maximum, then it's no problem for them to share one enclosure either. And you can have the whole enclosure together. So the Gemara asks one last question that we'll take for today, that still, Rabbi Shimon nami kevan denizra rubo have hahum miuta, batel legabe ruba, vave lekarpaf yoter mibetzatayim vasor. The problem is that I'll read the end and then I'll explain it. Ela itmar achi itmar ha miuta share. That what? So Amar Rav Huna Breid Rav Yoshua lo amaran ela de lo have betzatayim. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the next answer. Right. So we'll leave that. So what he means is like this: that still, if you have a situation in which the total area that's set aside for residence is the minimum, okay, is the minority of the space, and the majority of the space is made up of garden, we really have to look at the whole thing as a garden. Don't we always say majority rules? And so that means that basically if you had 3 sa'ah of space, and you used only 1 sa'ah for your house, and then you had a karpaf, you had a field or a garden of 2 sa'ah. So even though it's true that Rabbi Shimon would say you could carry from your yard, your house area, not in your house, but you could carry from the part that's for human activity into the garden and vice versa, it's no problem. But the fact is that since the majority of the space is designated for garden, we have to look at the whole thing as a garden. And then what does that mean you have? A 3 sa'ah space of garden. You can't enclose a 3 sa'ah space of garden. And since you can't enclose a 3 sa'ah space of garden, even Rabbi Shimon is going to have to say it's no good. Rather, what are we talking about here? We're talking about where you had something like a 5 sa'ah space. And so 3 sa'ah of the space was set aside for a courtyard and houses and whatever human dwelling. And then you had betzatayim, you had 2 sa'ah of space that was for a garden. So Rabbi Shimon will tell you that since the majority is for human activity, and since a betzatayim, an area of up to 2 sa'ah, you would be able to enclose it by itself if you wanted to, it doesn't ruin the enclosure of the whole area to have a garden of 2 sa'ah space, 2 sa'ah area, that 70 and 2/3 by 70 and 2/3 area, within your courtyard. The whole thing can be enclosed together. But if the garden exceeded that amount, if the garden was even bigger than that, so then it would ruin your entire enclosure. You would have a problem with the entire enclosure. But that's according to Rabbi Shimon. Those who continue the daf over Yom Tov will see that there's another explanation here according to the rabbis that changes it around a little bit.